Since we just spent a lot of time telling you how important budgets are before looking at teams, looking at partnering, looking at, that collaboration effort, it'd be kind of remiss if we didn't go ahead and talk about budget. Budgets are something a lot of people freak out about. And you don't really have to. Budgets can kind of be as easy as you make it, or they can be as hard as you make it. It's really up to you to figure out how you're going to use those funds. But remember, you're matching the funds to the scope of work. So when you're looking at those hours that are going to need to be utilized, or that amount of time, or any of those things that you potentially need to buy, you can get very granular, or you can stay within agency authorizations. Just like we said many times, budget and budget requirements actually vary greatly by different agencies. And there's a couple of key constants. Some agencies allow you to buy equipment. And if you do have the opportunity to buy equipment with their funding, really recommend not doing that. Buying equipment with government money can get very sticky very quickly. Most of the time, the agency or the government in general is going to own that piece of equipment until it's been fully depreciated. So even though it may be sitting in your shop, you don't own it. It's one of the things to kind of keep in mind. And different needs also might have different budgetary figures attached to it. When you are looking at that scope and you are looking at those objectives, you're trying to figure out how many hours it's going to take. Remember that the level of effort calculations is going to play into your budget, and it's also going to play into your budget narrative, which we're going to discuss in the next part. You're going to have to be able to justify everything in your budget at some point. Some agencies might not require that to be submitted, but always have the expectation that eventually they're going to ask, well, how are you justifying this? How do you need this? Why do you need this? What is this going to do for the project? When you're thinking of your budget, kind of keep those in mind. If you have to justify every expenditure, is this something you actually need? Is this material something you're going to be able to use up? And when you're looking at that, you're trying to figure that out, it's really great to go to outside sources. Sometimes you don't have to figure it out on your own. If it's somebody that you're going to hire, well, you can use the Bureau of Labor Statistics wage data. You can actually figure that out by the region, level of experience, job type. There's a lot of granular data there. For things like travel, well, use the GSA rates. They have per diem rates, they have hotel rates, they have mileage rates. If you use their rates, the agency's not really going to bat an eye. You're not going to have to, have like a vendor quote for an airline ticket. Or, well, GSA rates don't cover airlines. That's a terrible example. But for figuring out those travel costs or those anticipated travel costs, that's a really great tool because it's also the rates that the government abides by. And GSA is a governmental organization. They're the ones setting those rates. Those agencies are going to know those rates. They're not going to argue those rates because they're GSA. These are rates that they sort of set themselves. Sort of set themselves as in being two governmental entities. I hope you know what I meant there. And, again, like in that previous example, if it is a piece of equipment, if it is material, if it is a supply you need, if it's computer services you need, get a quote. Even if it's being able to pull up a historical price card on something like Amazon, having that documentation makes it a lot easier. Then the agency and the reviewers aren't going to go, why are they spending $1,500 on this thing? These things shouldn't cost $1,500. Well, bam, the vendor quote's right there. Okay, I guess they do cost $1,500. It leaves a lot less room for people to misunderstand where you arrived at your figures. Oh, what constitutes a budget, though? It's the amount of money necessary to see the project through to completion. And that's important to keep in mind because SBIR and STTR awards are firmed fixed price. That means that if they say that they're going to award you $256,000, you're going to get $256,000, or whatever that number is. It's not going to be a cost plus. You can't go back to them and say, well, I thought it was going to be $256,000, but it was actually $500K. I need, the rest of that money. They're going to go, well, you probably should have scoped better. It's not that you're going to be able to go back and ask them for more money. That's not how these work. What you get is what you have to work with. But pay attention to what those ceilings are. Remember, every agency typically has a different amount that their ceilings are. Some might have some weird, commonality there, but it's not on purpose. So if they say that it's $100,000 ceiling, then that's how much they're going to give, is awards up to $100,000. If you come in at 125, it's a really great way to have your proposal package immediately bounced and fail administrative review. You didn't pay attention to their budgets and you came in at a higher figure. Most of the time, that's what's going to happen. These programs aren't set up to kind of make you rich by going through them. They're actually really set up to offset costs. So it's not that you're going to burden them with the full cost of developing this product, developing this thing that'll get to the commercial market. All they're going to do is offset costs. You're still going to have to go out there and find funding. That's why the Phase 3 exists. But there is some sort of component there that, remember, it is just an offset. They're not going to pay for your full company operations for that year. They're going to pay for some research activities up to their ceiling, but it is one of those things that you can't have somebody at 100%. It's just not feasible. They're not going to dedicate their entire day, every single day, 365.25 days out of that year, or 2080. That's a normal amount of working hours. They're not going to fully pay for that. These programs are just to offset the cost of research and development. And one of the things that people often get, let's call it wrong, these programs are not really competitive in the way that most people think competitive. So a lot of times people will think, well, if their ceiling is $100,000, I'm going to bid $80,000. If I'm lower than other people, that's going to make it more attractive. And that's just not how these work. You're not competing with other people in most cases. You're actually competing with yourself. You're competing on how revolutionary your idea is, how innovative it is, how you've lined up the team. It is that competition factor that completely goes out of the window. If the ceiling is $100,000 and you're only bidding $80,000, well, that's literally $20,000 you left on the table. By going 20,000 under, you're not making the project more attractive. So always ask for the full amount, or as close to that full amount as you can get. But again, you have to be able to justify that. with your budget breakdown, a couple things to kind of keep in mind is your budget is really driven by your scope. We did talk about that before, how your scope kind of defines your budget. But when you're doing your budget, you're going to want to actually be very detailed in your scope. It's not just going to be, well, objective 1 is going to cost this much. Well, what are you going to do during objective 1, or aim 1, or challenge 1, or whatever agency specific definition or synonym there might be word. You're going to want to break those down into actual tasks. So, you might have objective 1 is to do X test. Well, what are you actually going to do during that test? How many hours is it going to take to get that result? How are you going to verify that result? You're going to start to put hours towards that. And again, these are just your best guess. And then you're going to add those hours up. That's how you're going to figure out the level of effort that's going to be required by your personnel. You really should have a clear picture of the work that's going to have to be done before you start creating that initial budget. It kind of goes hand in hand between scope and budget. It doesn't do any good to start writing a full proposal if you wait to do your budget till the very end, because maybe you're going to start putting those numbers together and decide, oh wow, this is totally outside of the scope. I'm going to need more funding. If that's the case, then you need to go back and look at your scope again. If you have to change your scope once your proposal package is pretty much complete, you're going to have a lot of rewriting to do. But getting into the actual technical aspects of a budget. So again, know what the budgetary limitations are. Know kind of how deep they want you to dive into the cost breakdown. Know if they have allowables versus unallowables. Know what their other documentation they're going to require. If they're going to require a budget justification. How detailed do you need to be in that? That gives you a good kind of head for how much do I have to figure this out? How, desperately deep dive do I have to do into this? Sometimes, for an agency, it might just be a lump sum for materials. Sometimes they might want an item by item. Sometimes you might have to give them also the quantity of how you arrived at that. When you're looking at the resources you're going to need to be able to pull off the project, keep that in mind. And when you're trying to get to that ceiling, there's kind of two schools of thought. One's not technically better than the other. It's just whichever way you're more comfortable with. You can either build up or you can work backwards. So you can either, start with those base costs and keep adding them together, or you could start with the ceiling and start subtracting those costs. That really comes more into play when you think about things like your indirect rates, which we're going to talk about very shortly here. And the reason we're going to talk about that very shortly is this is a really great example, and this is an example of National Science Foundation. We talked a lot about ceiling, and $256,000 seems like a lot. It seems like, wow, I can get a lot of work done for $256,000. But one thing to remember is $256,000 isn't actually $256,000, because every one of these agencies allows you to have a fee or a profit. So that's 7% right off of the top. Then you have your indirect costs. So you have that pool of money that you're going to be able to pay for business development activities. You're going to take that off. And then once you subtract those, you're going to see that the direct work you can do is generally about half of that amount. Keep that in mind as you're looking at creating your budget, is whatever the ceiling is, once you subtract out those factors, that ceiling isn't a lot of times very much to do work with. So as you're looking at that scope, kind of keep that in mind, is whatever that ceiling is, be aware of what that actual, well, whatever the scope is, be aware of what that actual ceiling is and match it appropriately. So for most SBIR and STTR projects, for phase one, it's going to be a lot of labor costs. Remember, you're doing research and development to determine technical feasibility for most agencies. So research and development is man hours. That just takes people time. They have to be able to, do that experimentation, do that testing, do that research, figure out where to go next, verify those results. Because you're not trying to get all the way to the goal. You're not trying to solve the technical problem. You're trying to see how you can address it. What can potentially work? What can you say with a, confidence level that, okay, I did some experimentation, I did some research, I showed that this is potentially possible. Because that's what your phase two is going to focus on. That's why it's a lot more budget. But those budgetary figures have to come from, it's going to sound dumb to say this, but reality. Remember, you're going to have to be able to justify those, and they have to be able to be easily verifiable. When you're doing things like your budget justification, you don't want to have to jump through a lot of hoops on, well, I came up with this number this way, or I'm not sure how I came up with this number, but this is what I need. They have to just be grounded in reality. Somebody has to look at that and go, okay, I can see why that's going to take this many hours, or I can see why that person would be on this for 80% of their time, or I can see why they would need these materials. That's why it's so integral to link, again, your budget and your scope just kind of hand in hand. Because if they're not, when people are reviewing your budget, they're going to go, wait, why do they need $30,000 in materials? There's nothing in their research plan that points towards that. That's why it's important to, just make sure that everything that you put in for the budget, somebody can go back and look at what you say you're going to do, look at those objectives, look at the research you're going to do and go, oh, okay, I can see where that link is. That link has to be concrete. And we kind of gave a really brief overview before and just introduced the fact, but the SBIR and STTR programs have what they call allowable and unallowable costs. So allowable are things you can request money for. They're allowed. Unallowables are things that you cannot have funding tied to. It can be either for phase one, or it could be for the entire project, phase one, phase two, and beyond. You have to know those differences. And within the solicitation, the agency is actually going to say what is allowable and what's unallowable. Most agencies will not cover costs associated with patenting. They're not going to cover costs associated with publishing. They're not going to cover costs associated with marketing. That's on you to market it. But there's a caveat there. You can use that fee or profit, or sometimes your indirect pool, to pay for those. As long as it is not a budget line item that you are requesting money for, then it's something that you can do and that you can approach. But enough kind of overview stuff. Let's talk about the actual things that drive your budget, your cost categories here. The first and foremost cost category, because again, remember, a lot of times it's the bulk of the budget, is labor. So people time. It's the individuals, their rates, their level of effort, or how many hours, calendar months, whatever they're going to put towards that. It is the amount of money that you are going to pay those people to do these very specific research tasks. And a lot of times it's just based on what are you paying them for an annual salary, and divide that by the number of hours they're going to work. And next thing that, across the board they allow is materials and supplies. Typically in a phase one, you're not going to have a huge material and supply budget, again, because it should be a lot of labor stuff. But material and supplies are the goods and other items that are going to be essentially, quote unquote, burned up during the research process. A material and supply can't be dual use. You can't say, well, I'm going to use this for this project, this SBIR, but then also I can take this same thing and go use it for this other project. If that's the case, a lot of times they're not going to allow that. It has to be used up for the purposes. Otherwise, you're buying half the amount, or you're only requesting half of the funding. Again, even the materials and supplies have to be tied directly towards that research activity. And one of the other kind of cost categories, and we've talked about it quite a bit, is your indirect rate. So how are you leveraging that? What's it being applied to? What is the actual rate? And obviously the question is, well, what's an indirect rate? So an indirect rate is essentially the cost for you to do business. A lot of times it'll be, things like facility rental, space, leases, utilities, administrative or clerical time. It is the cost that you incur to actually keep the business viable while the project is going on. And for a lot of companies, this can be really hard to figure out, because for a lot of people, well, they may not have actual paid work before this project, before this SBIR or STTR. They may not have something they can look back and go, okay, well, we have a 48% indirect rate because for every $100,000 of award we get, or for every $100,000 of revenue we get, this is how much it cost us to be a business. This is how much we have to pay out, because that's what drives your indirect rate. So it can be very tough to figure out your indirect rate, but just keep in mind that some agencies will actually have what they call like a safe harbor, or a limit, or an allowable indirect rate. And if you don't know your indirect rate, if you haven't ever been audited and have a government authorized one, it's probably a good idea to use that safe rate. Some people will actually, cut into that indirect rate. They'll say, well, when I started doing the budget, the scope of work I had isn't going to be supported by this indirect rate. I'm going to lower it. And that's typically a bad idea. Let's talk about why that's a bad idea. It's a bad idea because most people will, when they're cutting into their indirect rate, they'll also cut into the fee or profit. Remember, a fee or profit is allowed by every agency, and it's typically 7%. So that 7% is calculated based on all costs, direct cost and indirect cost. And it's important to keep in mind that the sum total of direct cost, indirect cost, and the fee or profit have to add up to that ceiling or less. So that ceiling isn't just for you to be able to put in direct work. It's going to be the total of all of these different elements. And a lot of people will go, well, I don't need a fee or a profit. And yes, you do, and you should actually request the maximum. Because the fee or profit, you don't have to explain. You don't have to justify. You don't have to say, well, I need this for this. It's your money to do with as you please. If you want to throw champagne and caviar dinners for your team when you get the award, well, you can use that fear of profit for it. Really don't recommend it. That your fear of profit's your rainy day fund, but you don't have to justify why you used it in that way. It's whatever you need to use it for. And because of that, you can pay for things like unallowables. And when you cut into your indirect pool or your fear of profit, you're also cutting into the flexibility you have. You're cutting into, what can I use this for? What things might come up? What else am I not thinking of? And eventually something's going to come up and you're not going to have enough in that fear of profit or indirect pool to pay for it. And if you do that consistently, well, you're just going to choke your business. You're not going to be able to grow. You're not going to be able to develop because you're just paying for the research work. You're not paying for all of the things that have to be done in the background. You're not paying for, or you don't have the funding to go do, that customer discovery, to go do patents, to go do publishing, to go do the things that are going to bring potential partners to the table, because all you have is funding just to do that research work. You're not setting up a healthy ecosystem for your business to grow or thrive. And because indirect rates are very tricky to figure out, this is just a really basic example. It's probably a pretty terrible example, but it shows you how you can get towards that fear or towards that indirect rate. So you add up really just what it costs for your business to be a business. So what do you pay out in fringe benefits? Those things that essentially keep employees healthy and keep them around. What do you pay out in rent? What do you pay out in average on utilities? What do you pay out in taxes? What do you pay out for research and development? What do you pay out for, marketing? That all gets added together. Then you take your total project cost or your total revenues that are coming in. So if you add all of your indirect cost up, and it's $100,000, and you add up all of your revenue and it's $200,000, well, you divide that 100,000 into the 200,000 and congratulations, you have a 50% indirect rate. Keep in mind though that no matter what your rate, you may have a 75% indirect rate. As long as you can justify it, more power to you. But you have to remember again that some agencies have caps. Some agencies have a rate that they say, we're not going to allow you to go over this until you get audited by a cognizant contracting agency. So keep that in mind, is no matter what your indirect rate is, if it's above one of those caps, yeah, you can request it, but until you have a cognizant contracting agency come in and, do an audit, make sure that you're costing what you're supposed to be costing right, make sure that you're dividing out, that chart of accounts, all of that stuff that you have to do during that audit. And in order to show that at the end of the day, you're not trying to screw someone over, then all you're going to be able to get is whatever that maximum is the agency says you can get. Kind of again, figuring out those rates can be very cumbersome, or it can be just kind of back of a napkin. And it is a summation of just, again, what it costs you to do business. So I used the term fringe rates before, and fringe is essentially what it keeps for you to have employees be happy. So things like PTO, things like health insurance, things like, bonuses, things like tuition reimbursement, 401k matching. Those are all fringe benefits. And then a lot of times, again, you'll have those summation of a bunch of indirect costs. So, your infrastructure is an indirect driver, your utilities, your tax payments, your general business costs, management and accounting, timekeeping software. The things that keep you functioning as a business go into that indirect pool. And whenever you're looking or go into that indirect rate, or just go into your indirect costs, because you have to kind of remember that even though people use these different terminologies for things like fringe, overhead, G&A, no matter what it is, those all get added together to give you your indirect rate. And this is just a quick kind of workup about how to figure that out. I realize we're diving deeply into indirect rate, but it's always one of those things that just confuses everybody. Again, so you're looking at your cost as a business. So we have here some really just finicky numbers. You have salaries, materials, equipment, travel. That's $307,500 that go towards those costs for those projects. That's how much it costs you to work on projects. And then you have all of the background stuff. So maybe you have rent of $2,500 a month. Maybe there's non-project labor, so just administrative labor. Maybe that's 20%. Maybe you have a 12.5% depreciation rate. You add all of those different things up, and then you figure out that, okay, well, I have this total, I have this total. I'm going to break out my, overhead. I'm going to break out my fringe. I'm going to do those separately. Or it's a lot easier just to add them together and have that full indirect rate. Because even if an agency allows you to have an indirect rate, an overhead rate, a G&A rate, a fringe rate, you're going to only be able to apply some of those to some categories. Like your fringe rate, because it's employment costs, you can only apply that to your labor. Your overhead rate, and typically that is only a portion of the labor. A lot of times it factors heavily into materials and supplies, equipment, things like that. So it's a lot easier just to put all these together and say, okay, well, I have a 39% indirect rate because it cost me $120,000 and $120,203 to be a business, and it cost me $307,500 to work on projects. Now you remember, divide those together, and that gives you your rate. I realized that there wasn't a lot of, just very deep dive information for budgets. And it was a lot of really just simple overview. But remember, that's because these different agencies have different amounts that you can request. They have different cost categories sometimes. They have different cost drivers. They may even have different allowables or unallowables. So besides the indirect rates, which we dug into probably way too much, you just have a general sense now of how do you create a budget, how are you going to have to price stuff out, and why is it important to have those numbers in mind. It factors hugely into what are you going to do, how are you going to go about it, and do you actually have enough of what you need to get the job done. And that's another reason why it was a lot of general information for budgets, just because we can't tell you specifically which agencies allow for what type of budget. Otherwise, this video would be about 4 hours long. Ain't nobody got time for that. But it is just that general, well, what's important about a budget? What are my, overall breakdowns? And why do I need to look at those? Why do I need to do those? And how important is it to have a healthy budget for the business to grow and thrive?